Well, Dr. Elizabeth Buchanan, welcome to the NatCon Australia podcast.
Thank you, Dan. Happy to be here.
Yeah. Hey, you are one of the more interesting voices on geopolitics to come out of Australia, I think, in recent times. But for those not familiar with you and your work, how exactly would you describe your area of expertise and how did you get interested in it?
I like to say polar warfare or war at the ends of the earth because it sounds really dramatic. But essentially, I am a failed medicine surgery student who had a fear of blood unlocked in the first year of my degree. So fell into global arts as one does. I finished up general political international relations and philosophy studies, and then went and worked at Royal Dutch Shell down in Melbourne. And actually, there my interest in the Arctic geopolitical scene was unlocked. Um, Obviously, the company was very interested in offshore drilling rights at the time, and they didn't have many people on staff internationally that had contemporary Russian geopolitical insight and understanding. So a lot of the Cold War era expertise was still kind of on the bench. So I was interested from that point. And what led to the PhD in the end, which was on Russian Arctic warfare under Putin, was we had this country, this relatively new country, right? Um, that Russia, the Russian Federation, since it had kind of reborn out of the Soviet Union, it was innately aggressive and assertive in most of its foreign policy dealings elsewhere. But when it came to the Arctic frontier, it was all about collaboration and cooperation, attracting foreign investment, capital, and technology and partnerships, and making it a market for itself, right? To really unlock the economic potential of the Russian Arctic. And that duality of that identity was fascinating for an IR scholar, right? Um, so I couldn't find anything on at book length at all, a study into how these two identities exist in foreign policy and how, on one hand, you can have the US at the time, smacking Russia on the arm for being expansionist in Eastern Europe, but then having all of its multinational oil companies that have GDPs bigger than most African states, whining and dining with inner circle Moscow political staffers. So I was like, that's a really interesting thing. And then I did the PhD, and then I was lucky enough to be selected for the NATO Defence College postdoc program. And they were really interested, the alliance at the time, on the return of the GRUK gap, so the Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom maritime choke point in the North Atlantic, which the alliance had taken its eye off since there was no Soviet Union. Um, so I did a little bit of work there, and then I came back to Australia, was lucky enough to get selected to lecture in strategic studies at the Australian War College here for our DSSC, so those going to one star. Um, and that's when I started doing a bit more work on the broader polar issues. So Antarctica came into the fold there. And,
Mm.
not until you're in a sector do you realize perhaps just how undercooked and undervalued um, a subject is. And Australian Antarctic interests are just, criminally neglected.
Yeah. The poles, not the Poland, but the North and South Pole, have certainly become of greater sort of news interest in recent times. And well, let's get down to brass tacks. Probably the one that's dominating the headlines at the moment is Trump's suggestion that he's interested in annexing Greenland. That's often portrayed in the Australian press, at least, as sort of completely over the top, outlandish claim, and also a bit frightening, which I guess it is. But are there legitimate reasons why the US is interested in Greenland or should be interested in Greenland?
Absolutely. It's one of my favorite topics at the moment just because it happens to be so timely and in most of the major newspapers. And it's very clickbaity, right? You've got a sitting
Mm.
US president who is saying to a NATO territory, none the least, "We are taking you. We need you, and we will take you." It kind of jars with what we expect of our good old liberal West, ally. But I have a book coming out in 2 months' time, and I'm gonna be really tacky and plug it, Dan.
No, do it.
But it is called So You Want to Own Greenland, and it is with Hearst Publishing, in the UK. It will be rolled out in Australia as well, but it is a really fun, short and sharp study of all of the attempts to, quote, unquote, "own Greenland," since the Vikings landed there in,
Mm,
um, the late 900s, early 1000 era, right up until when, they went missing, which is essentially the case of the Norwegians went to check in on the colonies that were known to be on Greenland at the time in, the 1400s, and they arrived to nothing but Inuit presence. So
mm,
it's really fun and fascinating. But in the study that I did to write the book, it was really interesting because the US has announced its intention to consume, I'd say is the right term, the territory of Greenland, since Truman. So it's something that kind of comes back on the US interest, every couple of decades. First and foremostly, it's basic geography 101. Like, this is not a European territory.
mm,
This is a North American piece of crust, right? That's where it
mm,
falls. Um, it is in many ways a buffer. If you just think of the globe, if you're looking down on the North Pole, you've got Greenland, you've got Canada, US, it is a buffer into the North Atlantic. So it was really important during the Cold War, obviously. We had all sorts of weird and wonderful American missions. So Camp Century is my favorite, and I urge all readers to, all listeners rather, to jump online and fall into the depths of a Google spiral on Camp Century um,
mm,
when you've got time. So it's not a new phenomenon, first of all, for the US or for Washington to have interest in this territory. Um, it makes sense. What has put it, I guess, on steroids, number one is this kind of cult of personality that, oh, because Trump has said it, it must be messy and it must be outlandish and it's just wild. And it's not the case. The second, I guess, cultivating factor here for, I guess, the furor over this Greenland interest from Trump is that Greenland now has returned into the strategic lens that it once had during the Cold War, right? Its proximity between the Soviet Union and the US. But now it's between a assertive China that has normalized and kind of internationalized its position in the Arctic as a legitimate Arctic player.
mm,
You are not. You are very far from the Arctic. Um, you call yourself, a near Arctic power. That does a lot of things, but first and foremostly, it cultivates a sense of national pride in the region, and it normalizes behavior and presence and whatnot. But those pressures mean that we have a Chinese footprint closer to the US homeland, but we also have congestion issues. So if you think of the GI-UK gap, and if you're thinking of the future of global trade routes potentially reorientating in terms of Asia-Europe trade, moving away from the kind of Indian Pacific, South Sea China belt and going north, Greenland becomes a very valuable piece of real estate. So it makes sense, right? Um,
mm,
if you're shipping between Europe and Asia, you're going to want to have some kind of footprint or some kind of transshipment hub or something there. Um, so they are, I guess, the main baskets of reasons why it is very much a legitimate interest. And I think it's
mm,
been lost in this kind of, well, if Trump wants it, then something's wrong with
mm.
that
I mean,
logic.
he's also even more provocatively talked about potentially annexing Canada. And I guess, again, that sounds a little bit more far-fetched and over the top, but there must be, I suppose, beneath all this, some genuine concerns in the US about the Arctic and security interests there, and the ability of Canada and Denmark and other people to be able to provide the security that the United States thinks it requires. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, just think of the world, in a globe, you're looking down at the North Pole. you have an entire, via Alaska, an entire back doorstep for the US homeland that
Mm,
is wide open. And it's not
mm,
only wide open, it's not something that you can easily reorientate your defense assets to right now or tomorrow. You need
mm,
ice hardened, you need polar capable assets, nuclear powered submarines, you need icebreakers. So the issue, I think, for the Trump administration is, and thank God there's, someone looking at the 360 view of national security for that country, which, Australia absolutely needs to start doing more of. But they've realized there's nothing in the shed. They've got no assets that they can just roll out quickly and bolster and fortify that frontier. And so this is why we're seeing, ice pact partnerships and, burden sharing ideas. But I think the logic for the Trump circle is go to the maximalist kind of argument of, well, you've been free riding, you've not been holding up your end of the bargain, Canada. We're just going to move in and sort it out for you. Same with Greenland. And I guess it's a negotiation tactic for some of
mm,
us who are used to big corporate negotiation tactics. It's, go far beyond the goalpost for what you actually need and desire. What does
mm.
the US need from Canada at the moment? It just needs them to invest in their own Arctic footprint, which
Yeah.
is a central point for Canada. With Greenland, the same thing. They just
Mm.
need the Danish to unlock the gates and say, you know what, the footprint we've agreed upon um, at the air space base here is not serving its purpose. We need to we need to make this bigger. Here are the areas in which you can build out, which they can under the existing treaty arrangement. I
So
think that's
so
where we're
what
going.
bases or what sort of presence does China and Russia, um, what do they both have, um, in the Arctic or sort of above Canada that might or in Greenland that might be sort of deemed threatening to the United States or a security risk at the moment?
Yeah, so we'll begin with Russia. So basic geography, you've got um, the longest coastline. So Canada has the longest Arctic coastline into the Arctic Ocean, um, but that's because of the kind of unique territory it has with ice flows. Um,
Mm,
Russia has the largest kind of slice of the Arctic, if you think of it as circular pie.
mm,
So if we're applying UNCLOS, UN, Law of the Sea, we've got the continental shelf that is underneath um, Russian landmass that extends out towards the North Pole. So Russia has a legitimate interest there, right? This is territory. This is economic resources in the seabed and in the sea column that Russia claims. And they've said this in a number of their foreign policy statements as well since about 2004, 2005, increasingly, that the Russian Arctic zone, that section of the Arctic, is the future resource base of the Russian Federation.
mm,
Um, so what they have done is reopened, they've redeveloped, and they've also built a few more military outposts right along the Arctic flank, we'll call it. So, first of all, a number of them were Cold War era, and I think we need to keep it like, the forefront of our mind. Um, this is normal behaviour for a wide open flank. Just look at what Australia is doing with the Northern Territory, and this is
mm,
what you do. This is normal business. They are investing in quite a lot more security measures because of the opening up of the sea lanes. So they're seeing more and more um, interest in shipping.
mm,
And so when that gets to be a busier area, you obviously want to keep eyes on because you don't know what's actually happening, what's monitoring, who's surveilling, or is it just, pure economic
mm,
activity. Then you've got China. So China does not have a territory at all above the Arctic Circle. So we usually use the Arctic Circle as kind of the identifier for an Arctic nation. If you've got territory above that, you're an Arctic nation. They don't have any, but they have increased in the last decade their investments in a number of Arctic countries, mainly in like critical mining, although Canada's worked to weed them out of a lot of projects. And in Greenland, they were also there's only 2 operational mines in Greenland. Um, they were part of some of the early days, for one of the mines there, and then they were removed after the US told Denmark, "You need to keep eyes on." So China is busy investing in developing port infrastructure with Russia along the Northern Sea route, which is a new trade route that is opening. Um, there's a lot of media kind of speculation as to how close that relationship is. A lot of people call them Arctic alliance. That's not the case. In fact, Russia's very wary of ceding too much control, and there's a lot of mechanisms in place to limit that. But where it gets really interesting in terms of the footprint of China in the Arctic, I would say, is Svalbard or Spitsbergen. So this is a archipelago, small island that is near Greenland, in the Arctic region, but that is under Norwegian sovereignty. But if you've signed the Spitsbergen Treaty, which Australia has, so you've got rights, and so do your children, to pop up to Svalbard and mine for economic gain, you cannot be denied. Not many people know that. um, China's also signatory, obviously, and they've got something called the Yellow River Station, and that is a huge research station that um, has some very interesting personnel and work happening. And in more recent months, we've seen both China and Russia promote something called the BRICS Polar Research
Mm.
Agreement. So, asking BRICS countries to invest in Arctic research and send your people, send your funds, but this is about presence. So if we then kind of I call it Arctic island hopping. So if we're hopping from Svalbard to Greenland, um, it just makes the territorial proximity of Greenland that much more important to the North American continent. Like it's
Yeah.
one skip away for China.
Just to give people a sense of it, and maybe you're not privy to all the information because some of it is, national security sensitive stuff. But during the summer months when the ice melts, what sort of activity do you actually see up there? Is it the case a little bit more like is it? I imagine it's not like the sort of South China Sea where you have sort of people cruising around and there's one-on confrontations. Are there frigates that go through? Are there submarines sort of going underneath the water at a constant pace? Are there kind of radio communications between different powers up there? Is it sort of a hive of activity, at least during the summer months, with potential kind of flashpoints that might arise?
Yeah, so a year
Yep.
round, I'd say it's a hive of activity. This is the gateway into the North Atlantic, right?
Mm,
So even if NATO when the Soviet Union fell, they took their eye off the GRUK gap, which is the Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom
mm,
choke point for submarine hunting, basically during this
mm,
in the Cold War. That was its primary goal. Different sorts of cables, seabed cables there that monitored whereabouts the Soviet subs were off to and when they'd left their ports. Really, really important for that time. And those capabilities weren't invested in by the alliance and by most of the North Atlantic powers because they turned their attention, to terrorism into the Middle East, and then they were
mm,
pirate hunting in the Mediterranean. That's what NATO started doing. Now, Russia's
mm,
back apparently, and Russia's a problem, so they've got their, main business model back online, which is defense and deterring in the North Atlantic. Which
mm,
makes Greenland so pivotal, right? In many ways, it's the roof of the North Atlantic. Um, so throughout the year, we would have NATO maritime operations strengthening that kind of bastion area. But the enduring issue, I think, for most Western military planners is the proximity of the Koala Peninsula, which is the Russian nuclear triad, right? And its access into, for the Russian Navy, its access into warm waters. So if you think of where
mm,
Russia is and the year round, the access it has into water throughout the year is really only the Pacific Fleet, and then up through the high north, we'll call it, because it's not technically Arctic. Arctic, it's high north and wraps around Norway and then out through the GRUK gap. And that's how the
mm,
Russian Navy, reaches the world, as it were. So, absolutely a hive of military strategic activity. And this is where we get kind of um, the problem that's kind of boiling away at the moment, which is states like China and Russia and India, India's a big player in the polar regions,
Mm,
they've got presence on icebreakers. They've got presence in the high north under the guise, and perhaps it's entirely legitimate, right? That's the issue with dual use capabilities and the blurring of civil and military. But
mm,
these are countries that are funding huge polar research missions to look at climate change, to look at how permafrost is shifting in these regions. And that is arguably legitimate work. But it also comes with huge naval vessels that have all sorts of radars and all sorts of satellite, capability that is important for tracking temperature changes and is important for tracking changes in fisheries. But it also has huge surveillance
mm,
implications. So it's hard, I think, at the moment to kind of dissect who is in the Arctic for kind of humanitarian collaborative research reasons and who is in the Arctic to really put pressure and limit the national security options of states that, want to utilize the world seas. And we're yet to see, where that falls. I will say that Greenland as well, historically, has been front and center for all strategic issues, all of the major wars. You know, Greenland. And this is what I talk about in my book. But in World War II, there were a number of Nazi weather stations manned by two or three very unlucky poor souls who were dropped into Greenland off fishing trawlers
mm,
because the weather patterns from Greenland were coming through into Western Europe. So you could tell what was coming. You could plan your operations. So
mm,
the idea that Greenland has just emerged as this kind of strategic flashpoint is not um, true to history, right? But that's what we do. I think we so often in the international affairs space and the political science space, conjure up um, issues of international security without kind of taking a step back and going, what's the history of this place, and how has it
yeah.
factored in before?
Mm. Before we come down to the South Pole and closer to Australia at least, in the North Pole, how do you think the next 10 years are sort of going to play out? I mean, if um, if the United States is not convinced that Greenland and Canada, again, the Danes and the Canadians are going to be able to lift up, their security presence there to a level satisfactory to Washington, what happens then? And what is also, I
Yeah,
feel
so
like always, yeah,
I would love to say, we're going to have NATO collapse and implode because it was never ready for um, Article 4 or 5 of the Washington Treaty to be called on a founding member. Um, I think it will be much less entertaining. But for Greenland itself, I think a few things are happening on the ground. Um, hmm, First and foremostly, the idea that the rest of the West, without the US, would come together and smack Trump on the hands for how he is treating liberal democracies elsewhere, I think is a fallacy and won't happen. Denmark has had the opportunity now for 6 weeks to call Article 4 of the Washington Treaty, which is essentially come together and listen to us tell you how hurt we are or how fearful we are about this threat that you have posed. That hasn't happened, and that says a lot. Um, Context of that is that Denmark is still not at 2% towards its NATO contribution. There are plans to get to 2%, maybe 2.5, but again, like most liberal Western countries, that's in 2030. For some reason, we've all picked, got together and picked that 2030 is the year that we'll start moving. So what Denmark often does is the Kingdom of Denmark, so the Faroe Islands, Greenland, and Denmark, say, well, our contribution to NATO is difficult to put in GDP, percentage of GDP terms, because we give you Greenland. So the alliance uses Greenland for surveilling, for training, and for hosting the US contingent, which is pretty much, as again, the roof of the North Atlantic. So
mm,
that buffer um, for Europe. Now, that's difficult because, yes, Greenland is Danish territory, but it is, since 2009, it's had, an element of autonomy and self-governance, which basically means that the Greenlandic people, 56,000 of them, can make most of their own laws, run their own country, except on affairs of defence, foreign policy, or, which is my favourite part of the Danish constitution, um, any issue that impacts the interests of the realm, which,
Mm.
you're a legal eagle, so you'd understand lawfare. This cup that I'm holding could impact the interests of the Danish realm, right?
Yeah.
So this is my point. So what that means is there are domestic influences underway with the Greenland issue, and that is the Greenlandic people have put together a draft constitution of their own. The Danish have said, yes, absolutely, we agree, you will become independent.
Mm.
Um, Again, so long as it doesn't affect the interests of the realm of Denmark, which begins this circular kind of self-licking ice cream. So the fact that the Greenlandic people are working, and they've had recent elections 2 months ago now, which put in a more moderate party in Greenland, but they still are working towards independence for the country.
Mm.
I don't think that will be frustrated by the Trump interest in Greenland. In fact, I think they're being really smart in Greenland, and they're using that to say, hey, we're not a political bargaining chip. You can't buy us, you can't take us, and Denmark can't give us away. So
Mm.
that groundswell movement of independence has just been strengthened. Um, Economically, Greenland relies, 80, 90% on Denmark. 100% of its healthcare, education, pensions, social services come from Denmark. So there's some really weird colonization aftermath effects here that are still at play.
Mm.
But I see Greenland in the next 10 years, um, absolutely under Trump, potentially under Vance as well, an influx of US boots on the ground at the agreed space air base there. Um, I think that there will be further assets based in Greenland for the value of the NATO alliance as well, so they will not be pushed back against.
Mm.
Again, you have a bigger defence footprint in Greenland, which is quite high to the north, so away from most of the south, which is where the nationals, Inuit people, actually live. I think we will see jobs and opportunities. They will enjoy that to service and to maintain these bases and these communities. I think the US will help with critical minerals, investing in a number of mines to come online. And I also think there will be some discussions between the Greenlandic government and the US administration about potentially reopening ports that were used in World War II,
Mm.
to the kind of east, southeast of Greenland, which would be useful for the US, for NATO, for allies to be able to really shape and deter in that North Atlantic region. Um, where it gets interesting is the question of Denmark and Greenland. So that's kind of its own relationship that is moving towards kind of conscious decoupling. So a divorce that will probably happen, right? But what happens in that is Denmark loses its Arctic identity. There is no part of the Danish territory other than Greenland that is above the Arctic Circle. So
Mm.
remember when I was talking about what makes a state Arctic is they've got territory above the Arctic Circle.
Mm.
So Denmark loses that. Um, what happens in the Arctic situation is at the moment the only real international disagreement in the Arctic is between Denmark by way of Greenland, Russia, and Canada. And that is to who owns the North Pole. So this
Mm.
is the application of law of the sea. So who owns the seabed and the sea column? seabed and the subsea resources of the North Pole region, which is where we think being the operative word, the bulk of hydrocarbons, so oil and gas reserves are. Huge amounts. So that currently, all three countries have put in their scientific pitch, their research, and that goes to a body within the UN, the Commission Intercontinental Shelf, and that body basically accept or reject the scientific evidence to say that that seabed, the North Pole area, is a continuation of XYZ territory.
Mm.
So how it's looking at the moment is we've still got a few years to go in the deliberations, but it will likely be that all three countries have valid scientific evidence to say the North Pole resources and the region are their national kit, their national bounty. So then, per the UN convention, all three have to get together and basically figure it out themselves. Now, it
Mm.
could be the case that they all come together and Russia comes together and they all sit and they say, right, we'll divvy it up three ways and Bob's your uncle. More likely, the state with the capability to actually operate in the high North Arctic Circle, Russia, with some 40 icebreakers,
Mm.
says, well, might is right, and you can't actually tell us to leave, so thanks, but this is ours. This could
Mm.
happen. There's also an argument here about the commercial value and the um, ability to extract the seabed resources and whether they're actually viable. You need oil. I think the last calculation I was running with some colleagues was Brent crude oil needed to be at $200 a barrel in order for
Okay.
Arctic seabed oil to be viable
Nice.
once we get it.
Mm.
Yeah, right. So the idea that there's a race for resources is kind of problematic. But the Greenland point is the Danish claim is on the back of Greenland's geographic proximity to this
Mm.
massive bounty of wealth. So there's a few ways to go about it, but we're wondering whether or not, the claim to the seabed needs to be rescinded by Denmark or handed or given to Greenland to then follow through with. But again, Greenland has no military. So do we really think that the Russian government, let alone the Canadian government, are going to say, this trillions of dollars of future resources and critical minerals,
Mm.
they're yours and, do what you will. I mean, that's just not real politics, right? So there's a number of things happening in the Arctic, I guess, geopolitical decade that we're looking at. But it's interesting because so much of it's chicken and egg. I mean, does Greenland push and secure its independence? Sure, that would be great. How would it finance itself as an independent nation? It doesn't have the
Mm.
manpower to unlock a lot of these critical minerals it sits upon. The Danish government sure as hell aren't going to be looking to hand over such vast economic potential and relevance, right? Strategic relevance. So the idea that Trump's interest in Greenland is the biggest thing that's threatening the Arctic security picture to me is kind of funny because I'm like, no, it's probably one of the most helpful things that can happen right now.
Yeah. Oh, there's always more method in the madness than I tend to
Right?
find with Trump stuff, yeah. Hey, moving down to the other end of the world, the Antarctic, can you give us a kind of Cook's tour about which national governments have a presence there? Who's down there and what are they doing?
I always get so fascinated with the Antarctic questions because um, we have as a nation, Australia. We're a nation of proud, proud people who wouldn't stand for a third party or another country, you know, doing half of what Trump has done with Greenland.
Mm.
Right? The Australian way of life, we would not be happy with someone coming and saying, "Well, Queensland is ours and we'll take it." Like
Mm.
there'd be a huge backlash. And yet with the Antarctic, we as a nation have essentially laid down and ignored it. So we have a 42% claim to the Antarctic, which
Mm.
is, inverted from the Arctic, so it's a landmass, right? Not a water, not an ocean. 42% claim to the Antarctic, which essentially works out to be 70% of the Earth's fresh water. Which is, I always like to give that fact because, we talk about resources being what humanity has always fought over and gone to war over. When it comes to fresh water, Australia has a legitimate territorial claim to 70% of the Earth's fresh water. It's locked up in an ice cap for now, but that's what we're sitting on, right? And that's not to mention all of the critical minerals, the uranium, oil and gas, fisheries, krill, which is a really tiny little crustacean, but it's the foundation to the global food chain. So in the waters surrounding our claim, that we're sitting on that. And because we don't know about it, or because we maybe a learned ambivalence towards it, because we know about it, but we know we can't do anything about it, we can't secure it, we just don't think about it. So essentially you've got claimant states who have, before 1959, which is when we negotiated the Antarctic Treaty, have kind of wedges of Antarctica claimed. We have the largest kind of slice, and we base that on, if you think of, again, let's go for the flat earthers, world map, flat. If you look down to the southern approaches of Australia and you drew kind of an inverted triangle, that correlates broadly to what we've sliced out of Antarctica. So the treaty came about. Interestingly enough, it was a negotiation in which Australia, and at the time we were under Menzies government, worked very closely with the Soviet Union. And I did a whole lot of archival work about this because it was fascinating that we were in the Petrov affair era of the time, and we were looking for reds under the beds and, the communist threat. And yet very, very quietly, we were negotiating in lockstep with the Soviet Union because Canberra realised that Washington rejected and absolutely had no chance in hell of supporting the Australian claim to that territory. They still don't support it today, to this date. They don't recognise the claim. So that's a fun little history fact for you. Obviously, we worked on the Soviet US competition and took advantage of that. So we came together and we now have 29 what we call consultative parties to the treaty, of which we are one of the founding 12. And that means that we have set aside, and this is really important, we haven't set aside the claims to the continent, we've just set aside the debate over them. So it's neither here nor there. And also the treaty allows Russia and the US to stake a claim to any or all of the continent.
Okay.
Once
Do
the
people,
once
but
the
in terms
treaty's
of,
up.
regardless of the claims and their legal status, what sort of hardware do people actually have down there? And are any, military bases, or are they just sort of a scientific presences or research
Yeah, so
stations?
to be a consultative party, so to join the treaty, to be able to vote in a consensus agreement environment, which, it's dead on arrival, let's be honest, you need to show that you've got scientific interest and capability in the Antarctic. So we call them research stations, right? So Australia, we are, I think, 4 from last 4 year. We've got 4 down there on the continent. China has 5 and has just announced its 6th one. So they are building them they're all modular. They've really advanced the way that they're doing them. Russia has dropped down. I think they were towards 7. Now they're at 4 year round. So, and they've just announced as well that another one will be coming back online. The US has my favourite station, which is essentially at the geographical South Pole. And that does a lot. And first of all, that reaches into every single existing claim that they
You're
don't
right.
recognise. And it's also got quite a big strategic significance that it's there. And fun fact, is operated by Leidos, which is a US military contractor. So
Yeah.
military contractors are allowed. You can have military assets. You can have rifles there should you need to defend yourself against penguins, so long as you
Mm.
can argue that they are in support of scientific ends. So
Does
this is
this
where, again, the issues that we've got in the North Pole come into play. This kind
mm,
of blurring of what is civil research,
mm.
scientific, and what is military strategic and towards a more pervasive end.
I guess the US concerns about the Antarctic, and correct me if I'm wrong, aren't going to be the same as those in the Arctic because, there isn't a direct approach from obviously the Antarctic to the United States. But what does the US, do you think, expect from Australia with regard to our security obligations in
Yeah.
Antarctica? And will these, to be to be assembled a bit in Australia, nuclear powered submarines that we're getting in due course, will they assist with that?
Yeah, so the Antarctic interest for the US is part of that, I guess, great power identity,
Mm,
the reach to say that you're at both ends of the earth. They've also got a historical interest, right? Um, they've had Operation High Jump, it's an enduring one. It still happens, and that is sending US military Marines and SEALs down to Antarctica for extreme weather training. Um, in the negotiations in the lead up to the treaty, the main point of discussion was we have opened, it was during the Cold War, right? So it's huge. It's always lauded as this evidence of, international collaboration and cooperation in heightened times.
mm,
But basically, the leaders came together and they said, well, we've allowed an international geophysical research year. We've asked the Soviets to come. They're doing some great research next to the Americans, but elsewhere, we're in a deep conflict.
mm,
Problem is, we don't think we can extract them after this scientific event is over. We
mm,
think they're setting up and they're going to stay.
mm.
So that was the issue. That's how we came up with the treaty because we couldn't get them out.
Okay.
The US, yes, I understand how if you're thinking of a map, it's quite far away from the Antarctic. So the Arctic is much more pressing, number one, because it is
Mm,
um, an approach. And you've got the Alaskan, you've got a state in the Arctic. It has its own resources, its own interests there.
mm,
But if you think, again, I'm going to ask you to think of a map or to find yourself a map, listeners, move and have a look at the Pacific Ocean. So if you think of the roof of the Pacific Ocean, you've got the Arctic, you've got the Aleutians, you've got quite an interesting choke point there, which, like last year, for the first time, the Chinese Navy sent vessels into the Arctic via
mm,
um, the Beaufort. So you think of the floor of the Pacific Ocean, you have Antarctica, you have the Southern Ocean. So this entire strategic Pacific theatre, in many ways, is polar. And this is what I like to always argue. You've got the roof and the floor of an entire strategic theatre in which the poles, are gateways into these theatres. So the US interest is also around um, what China has been doing slowly but surely in the South American Antarctic slice. So it has built up stations and presence in the Drake Passage,
mm,
not only on Antarctica, but in Chile,
mm,
through Argentina, South America, sorry. So if you have issues with the Panama Canal, what is your alternative to the Panama Canal? It's the Drake
mm,
Passage.
mm,
So how China has positioned itself, it can very much choke off that um,
mm,
alternative trade route. Southern Ocean wise, if you've got congestion, if something happens in the South China Sea and it kicks off, you're going to be using the Southern Ocean.
mm,
So all of these plan Bs and plan Cs for a lot of competing countries um, require a presence or a capability to launch from the Antarctic landmass. And again, if you flip the world over on its head and you're looking down at Antarctica, it is the only continent that reaches into all three major oceans, Pacific like
mm.
basins, with you're free to run. There's no,
Yeah.
um, it's a freedom to run, and, what they say is, who controls the world? Who controls the seas controls the world. So it's a lot of foresight there from China, which the US absolutely needs to nip in the bud. For Australia, what does it expect of Australia when it comes to Antarctica?
Mm.
I think it goes back to the ANZUS Treaty, honestly, which is where, Australia and New Zealand were pretty much meant to look after the South Pacific. And
Mm.
if you free up the US, we said we would do that. Did we invest? No. Have we stepped up? No. Um, have we lost what's going on in our South Pacific region, and how deep China and Russia actually are in these regions? You know, we act surprised. We really shouldn't be, sadly. But we haven't been scolded as yet from the Trump administration.
No,
So
we
the
haven't received
southern
the Canada treatment, have we? And so it's sort of, and I'm kind of curious as to
I mean, I think that's
whether.
coming, and I think that the Southern Ocean's an absolute dire situation,
Mm.
for the number of Chinese fishing trawlers that are there, fishing flotillas, you can call them, um, which is problematic. So the French conduct all of our search and rescue operations in the Southern Ocean.
Mm. Interesting.
It's a
Hey,
huge, huge area. Can't do it all ourselves. Um, yeah.
but the subs will help, right? The subs will cruising down in the Antarctic. Surely, if they arrive, I know you're a little bit skeptical about that, but they should, increase our capacity to do all sorts of um, patrol and surveillance, work down there. No, you're looking skeptical.
An SSN capability absolutely would
Mm.
suit an island continent like Australia,
Mm.
just in terms of our approaches and where we need to be. We're still selling them in terms of it being a solution if we ask the Chinese to hold off for 2 decades,
Mm.
uh, for the South China Sea and for our northern approaches. Um, I think we are completely blind when it comes to our southern approaches. And
Mm.
NATO has, as I said, NATO has learnt that lesson when it comes to the Arctic issue. It pivoted away from the 360-degree security focus, and Australia has done that as well. We've almost institutionalized it in our defense thinking. Our defense strategy, our national security strategies all have that kind of geographical framing of the Northeast.
Yeah.
And, that's why you talk to any kind of international scholar or foreign policy nerd in any of our allied countries, and for them, it's just wild
Mm.
that an island nation in the smack bang in the middle of the Indo-Pacific seems to think it only needs to have capabilities and a plan for a segment
Yeah, it's
of its
interesting.
approach.
There's so much to cover, and I try to keep these things to an hour. So I'll just wrap up with a couple of maybe quick fire questions. This one's always been of interest to me. I read it online. I think it came from Albert Marco, who's an online commentator and a very astute one. So much of this, why the polls have been kind of quote unquote heating up, is because of the projection that climate change is making it more possible to navigate, especially in the North Pole, than it once was. And he said online that a favorite story was that Al Gore used the Arctic ice thickness to prove global warming. He said it was because, except that he was using DoD published data that was meant to mislead the Soviets for subs breaching the ice during the Cold War. Have you ever heard that before? I thought it was a very interesting kind of potentially plausible um, piece of information that I haven't seen verified. So you haven't heard that? So basically,
No, I
that
thought.
the DoD lied about the thickness during the Cold War to put off the Soviets from doing, having their subs go through there. Believe it or not. Anyway, that maybe push it to one side.
Okay,
It's
I'll pay that. There's a lot of warfare mind games going on.
Yeah. Secondly, you write not just about the polls, but about geopolitics politics more generally. And you had an article in the Australian last week, which I encourage people to read. I'll pop it in the show notes. And your quote from that was, we don't know what we are fighting for, Australia. We don't know who we want to be in the international community and how to get there. So concepts oft repeated like preparedness and resilience hardly matter in that context. What do you think? First of all, what should Australia aspire to be? What should we aspire to be, and what sort of models should we use as a guide for our nation over the next sort of 10, 20 years?
Return to our innovative roots.
Mm,
Our celebration of trying, of I guess I don't want to be cringe, but battling, right? Um,
mm,
we're too afraid to fail to the
mm,
point that we aren't pushing the boundaries, we aren't taking risk where we need to. I think we need to work so much smarter in terms of our defense posture, in terms of our thinking around how we can get to where we need to be. I absolutely agree. SSNs are a great piece of kit. I just don't think we need to own them. I think there are ways in which we can be a trusted and a valuable piece of real estate, work with our strengths to sustain and maintain allied or partners SSNs in the region, and free ride, I guess, strategic free ride off that defence lift that we can then have
mm,
if they are operating out of Australia. Um, I also, I would want people, I think, to flick back through our history. Australia has been just with the Dawn, right? Radar network we've sold to the Canadians. Like, we are the hub and heart of so much defence innovation internationally,
mm.
and we just need to get back to that.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. The other point you made just offline, prior to this discussion, was that there's a bit of a generational difference between people like yourself in the national security community. What do you think that explains that difference? What is it? And between yourself, people like yourself, and those who still dominate the opinion pages um, of the major broadsheets and institutions in Australia?
I think that we have lost our way in terms of, um, well, I guess it's maybe we lost our way. We don't trust the public enough to
Mm,
have hard choices or to have unpalatable discussions about how dire our region is.
mm,
We've got an entire generation, I wouldn't say millennials like me, who are now moving into middle management in defence sectors, whether it's in private sector or in government itself, or into some leadership positions as well, right? But we are the product of, the 9/11 era. So war and conflict has by and large been something that is happening over there beyond our borders. We might send some aid, we might send some boots, we might, tinker around the edges, and that's how we help. But I don't think our generation has been threatened to the point that we take anything going on in our region seriously. And, I want to say, we're desensitized to what international conflict probably looks like. And
mm,
it just goes into the point of I don't think we're ready for perhaps we're already in the throes of a colder war. Um, and the idea that we are electing governments to continue on a path of she'll be right and well, nothing bad has happened or too bad has happened with these guys. Let's not rock the boat. It's fundamentally depressing that we're not taking, we're not wanting to take innovative or risks. We're not wanting to question assumptions. Um, there is, the submarine story, for example, is really interesting because so much of the pushback against people who say, AUKUS Pillar 1 probably won't happen. We won't build nuclear submarines here. So much of the discourse around that is, well, you can't say that because that's un-Australian. Like, we can battle and we can do it and we've done it before. Um,
mm,
and also we've lost far too much time. So let's not change the plan again. But my point is, that's not adequate anymore. There are plans that we can put in place that give us different options. Um, And we should have the faith and I guess the confidence to have those discussions, not be afraid to have them.
mm.
Things aren't great in our region. Things aren't great here. Um, it's time to, call bullshit.
Cool. Yeah, like, they probably won't publish that, but yeah, but they probably should. Hey, you've got this new book coming out. So you want to in Greenland. Are you doing? Is that going to be? Are you going to be around the country or speaking on that, um,
Oh, no, no plans yet. But if your listeners all rush to the Hearst website and order and
yeah,
demand a speaking tour, um,
yeah,
yeah, no plans yet. And my next book after that will be unpacking this discussion about, the millennials in positions of defense power and defense policy making
mm,
internationally, how we think about war and how we think about the world, and why our political preferences and our policy ideas are so different to that of our, you know, boomer boomer parents.
yeah. Hey, we've only scraped the surface. It's such a big, interesting topic. I'll drop all the places where you've been published and what in the show notes so people can check out you and your work and all the nuances that there are to it. Um, and look forward to keeping in touch in future as things heat up. I suppose. Yep. I'm sure that joke's been used before
Don't
regarding the poles.
need a polar pun. A polar pun is good.
There you
Thanks,
go.
man.
Great stuff. Cheers. Bye.